We cannot agree with the present proposal to resolve collective security issues without the Russian Federation. This will not work.
Well, that was the Russian foreign minister slamming Europe for what he says is an attempt to prolong the war in Ukraine. That's not how Ukraine's allies see it. The issue of guaranteeing Ukraine's post-war security, it has shot to the top of the agenda. For Kyiv, security is paramount, and it's unlikely there'll be a ceasefire or an end to fighting without lasting security for Ukraine. Russia wants in on those security talks. Anything else, Moscow says, will lead nowhere.
I'm sure that in the West, and above all in the United States, they understand perfectly well that seriously discussing security issues without the Russian Federation is a utopia, a road to nowhere.
Lavrov's statement about security comes after he played down prospects of a bilateral meeting between the Russian and Ukrainian leaders, saying it had to be prepared, quote, step by step. Now, we've seen a whirlwind of diplomatic activity in the past days regarding the war in Ukraine, a host of European leaders flocking to Washington to pay their respects to President Trump while attempting to bend his ear. Now, this followed what many observers say was a stunningly successful Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, successful for the Russian leader, that is. Their meeting resulted in little of substance apart from Putin's return to the international stage and some big power politics, muscle flexing in the form of a nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bomber flying above Trump and Putin's heads. Matthew Karnitschnig is editor-in-chief of Euractiv, a European news outlet based in Brussels. I asked him whether the Russian foreign minister is right that security talks without Moscow at the table will go nowhere.
Well, thanks for having me. I think that you put your finger on the central question here, because the talks aren't just treading water. They haven't even really begun yet. And we can already see some pretty fundamental questions here about what they're going to be allowed to even table on the sort of pro-Ukrainian side of this equation. Because if the Russians are saying they're not going to allow, say, NATO troops to police this deal, that's really going to limit the scope of any peacekeeping mission. And, it is a bit, out of the ordinary, I think, at this stage, before the negotiations have even begun, to be, drawing these kinds of red lines. And this could just be tactics on the part of the Russians. I mean, I'm sure it is in some respects, but at the same time, it's also clear that the Russians, they're playing for time here. They want to draw out these pre-negotiations, I think, for as long as possible, because they're having some successes on the battlefield.
I mean, the Russian foreign minister, he does have a point that security talks without Russia being at the table are, pointless. It almost feels like the Europeans are trying to put the cart before the horse in order to keep up with President Donald Trump. How do you see that?
Well, I think, of course, it's pointless to not include the Russians in the broader negotiations. But when you're talking about what security guarantees Ukraine might get from its Western partners, I think you can make an argument that Russia isn't really central to that. If Ukraine decides to secure guarantees from the United States about, its future safety under a peace deal with the Russians, you could argue that the Russians don't necessarily need to be part of that deal, or maybe they shouldn't even be part of that arrangement. So I think it cuts both ways, and it's clear, though, at this stage that the Russians are not just going to embrace a quick deal, which I think is something that President Trump has sort of telegraphed in recent days, that they're going to have another summit in a few days or in a couple of weeks, and they're going to hammer something out quickly. It just seems like this process is going to be much more difficult to bring over the finish line than people might have anticipated in Washington a few days ago.
And these European security guarantees, I mean, we're basically talking about maybe European troops in Ukraine. Trump has said there could be U.S. air support. But I was just looking at the latest poll numbers. A majority of Germans are adamantly against sending any troops into Ukraine. I mean, can Europe make any promises like this at the moment?
Well, I think, individual European countries could make promises to send troops, and I think that some probably would be quite willing to do so. If you're thinking about the Baltic countries or Poland or, the countries that might be a little bit more concerned about Russia aggression than, say, Germany. I think it's also important to remember that these peacekeeping troops often serve as a kind of tripwire. So you don't necessarily need to have hundreds of thousands of troops there policing the border. And it's also worth remembering this is quite a long front line. It's over 1,000 kilometers long. And the border of Ukraine with Russia and Belarus is even longer. So, this would have to be some kind of a almost token force. But, as you said, there would be some teeth behind any security arrangement that Ukraine would be willing to accept, I think, in the form of air support from the United States and other NATO members.